Chapter 21 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. The New Enterprise. One bright and never to be forgotten day, Nettie and Jerry stood together in the new room, and surveyed with intense satisfaction all its appointments. They were ready to begin business. On that very evening the room was to be "open to the public." They looked at each other as they repeated that large sounding phrase, and laughed gleefully. There had been a great deal to do to get ready; hours and even days had been spent in planning. It astonished both these young people to discover how many things there were to think of, and get ready for, and guard against, before one could go into business. There was a time when with each new day new perplexities arose. During those days Jerry had spent a good deal of his leisure in fishing; both because at the Smiths, and also at the Deckers, fish were highly prized, and also because, as he confided to Nettie, "a fellow could somehow think a great deal better when his fingers were at work, and when it was still everywhere about him." There were times, however, when his solitude was disturbed. There had been one day in particular when something happened about which he did not tell Nettie. He was in his fishing suit, which though clean and whole was not exactly the style of dress which a boy would wear to a party, and he stood leaning against a rail fence, rod in hand, trying to decide whether he should try his luck on that side, or jump across the logs to a shadier spot, trying also to decide just how they could manage to get another lamp to stand on the reading table, when he heard voices under the trees just back of him. They were whispering in that sort of penetrating whisper that floats so far in the open air, and which some, girls particularly, do not seem to know can be heard a few feet away. Jerry could hear distinctly; in fact, unless he stopped his ears with his hands, he could not help hearing. And the old rule, that listeners never hear any good of themselves, applied here. "There's that Jerry who lives at the Smiths," said whisperer number one. "Do look what a fright! I guess he has borrowed a pair of Job Smith's overalls. Isn't it a shame that such a nice looking boy is deserted in that way, and left to run with all sorts of people?" "I heard that he wasn't deserted; that his father was only staying out West, or down South, or somewhere, for a while." "Oh, that's a likely story!" said whisperer number one, her voice unconsciously growing louder. "Just as if any father who was anybody would leave a boy at Job Smith's for months, and never come near him. I think it is real mean. They say the Smiths keep him at work all the while, fishing. He about supports them, and the Deckers too, with fish and things." At this point the amused listener nearly forgot himself and whistled. "Oh, well, that's as good a way as any to spend his time. He knows enough to catch fish and do such things, and when he is old enough I suppose he will learn a trade. But I must say I think he is a nice looking fellow." "He would be if he dressed decently. The boys like him real well; they say he is smart; and I shouldn't wonder if he was. His eyes twinkle as though he might be. If he wouldn't keep running with that Decker girl all the time, he might be noticed now and then." At this point came up a third young miss who spoke louder. Jerry recognized her voice at once as belonging to Lorena Barstow. "Girls, what are you doing here? Why, there is that Irish boy; I wonder if he wouldn't sell us some fish. They say he is very anxious to earn money; I should think he would be, to get himself some decent clothes. Or maybe he wants to make his dear Nan a present." Then followed a laugh which was quickly hushed, lest the victim might hear. But the victim had heard, and looked more than amused; his eyes flashed with a new idea. "Much obliged, Miss Lorena," he said softly, nodding his head. "If I don't act on your hint, it will be because I am not so bright as you give me credit for being." Then the first whisperer took up the story. "Say, girls, I heard that Ermina did really mean to invite him to her candy pull, and the Decker girl too. She says they both belong to the Sunday school, and she is going to invite all the boys and girls of that age in the school. and her mother thinks it would not be nice to leave them out. You know the Farleys are real queer about some things." Lorena Barstow flamed into a voice which was almost loud. "Then I say, let's just not speak a word to either of them the whole evening. Ermina Farley need not think that because she lives in a grand house, and her father has so much money, she can rule us all. I, for one, don't mean to associate with a drunkard's daughter, and I won't be made to, by the Farleys or anybody else." "Her father isn't a drunkard now. Why, didn't you know he has joined the church? And last Wednesday night they say he was in prayer meeting." "Oh, yes, and what does that amount to? My father says it won't last 6 weeks. He says drunkards are not to be trusted. They never reform. And what if he does? That doesn't make Nan Decker anything but a dowdy, not fit for us girls to go with. And as for that Irish boy, why doesn't Ermina go down on Patty Lane and invite the whole tribe of Irish if she is so fond of them?" "Hush, Lorena, Ermina will hear you." Sure enough at that moment came Ermina, springing briskly over logs and underbrush. "Have I kept you waiting?" she asked gaily. "The moss was so lovely back there, I wanted to carry the whole of it home to mother. Why, girls, there is that boy who sits across from us in Sabbath school." "How do you do?" she said pleasantly, for at that moment Jerry turned and came toward them, lifting his hat as politely as though it was in the latest shape and style. "Have you had good luck in fishing?" "Very good for this side. The fish are not so plenty here generally as they are further up. I heard you speaking of fish, Miss Barstow, and wondering whether I would not supply your people. I should be very glad to do so occasionally. I am a pretty successful fellow so far as fishing goes." You should have seen the cheeks of the whisperers then. Ermina looked at them, perplexed for a moment, then seeing they answered only with blushes and silence, she spoke. "Mamma would be very glad to get some. She was saying yesterday she wished she knew some one of whom she could get fish as soon as they were caught. Have you some to day for sale?" "3 beauties which I would like nothing better than to sell, for I am in special need of the money just now." "Very well," said Ermina promptly. "I am sure mamma will like them. Could you carry them down now? I am on my way home, and could show you where to go." "Ermina Farley!" remonstrated Lorena Barstow in a low shocked tone, but Ermina only said, "Good bye, girls. I shall expect you early on Thursday evening," and walked briskly down the path toward the road with Jerry beside her swinging his fish. If the girls could have seen his eyes just then, they would have been sure that they twinkled. They had a pleasant walk, and Ermina did actually invite him to her candy pull on Thursday evening. Not only that, but she asked if he would take an invitation from her to Nettie Decker. "She lives next door to you, I think," said Ermina. "I would like very much to have her come. I think she is so pleasant and unselfish. It is just a few boys and girls of our age, in the Sunday school." How glad Jerry was that she had invited them! He had been so afraid that her courage would not be equal to it. Glad was he also to be able to say, frankly, that both he and Nettie had an engagement for Thursday evening. He would be sure to give Nettie the invitation, but he knew she could not come. Of course she could not, he said to himself. Isn't that our opening evening? But all the same it was very nice in Ermina Farley to have invited them. "Here's another lamp for the table," said Jerry gaily, as he rushed into the new room an hour later and tossed down a shining silver dollar. He had exchanged the fish for it. Then he sat down and told part of their story to Nettie. About the whisperers, however, he kept silent. What was the use in telling that? But from them he had gotten another idea. "Look here, Nettie, some evening we'll have a candy pull, early, with just a few to help, and sell it cheap to customers." So now they stood together in the room to see if there was another thing to be done before the opening. A row of shelves planed and fitted by Norm were ranged 2/3 of the way up the room, and on them were displayed tempting pans of ginger cookies, doughnuts, molasses cookies, and soft gingerbread. Sandwiches made of good bread, and nice slices of ham were shut into the corner cupboard to keep from drying. There was also a plate of cheese which was a present from Mrs. Smith. She had sent it in with the explanation that it would be a blessing to her if that cheese could get eaten by somebody. She bought it once, a purpose, as a treat for Job, and it seemed it wasn't the kind he liked, and none of the rest of them liked any kind, so there it had stood on the shelf eyeing her for days. There was to be coffee. Nettie had planned for that. "Because," she explained, "they all drink beer, and things to eat can never take the place of things to drink." It had been a difficult matter to get the materials together for this beginning. All the money which came in from the "little old grandmothers," as well as that which Jerry contributed, had been spent in flour and sugar and eggs and milk. Nettie was amazed and dismayed to find how much even soft gingerbread cost, when every pan of it had to be counted in money. A good deal of arithmetic had been spent on the question, how low can we possibly sell this, and not actually lose money by it? Of course, some allowance had to be made for waste. "We'll have to name it waste," explained Nettie with an anxious face, "because it won't bring in any money. But of course not a scrap of it will be wasted; but what is left over and gets too dry to sell, we shall have to eat." Jerry shook his head. "We must sell it," he said, with the air of a financier. Then he went away thoughtfully to consult Mrs. Job, and came back triumphant. She would take for a week at half price all the stale cake they might have left. "That means ginger cake," he explained. "She says the cookies and things will keep for weeks without getting too old." "Sure enough," said radiant Nettie. "I did not think of that." There were other things to think of. Some of them greatly perplexed Jerry. He had to catch many fish before they were thought out. Then he came with his views to Nettie. "See here, do you understand about this firm business? It must be you and me, you know?" Nettie's bright face clouded. "Why, I thought," she said, speaking slowly, "I thought you said, or you meant, I thought it was to help Norm, and that he would be a partner." Jerry shook his head. "Can't do it," he said decidedly. "Look here, Nettie, we'll get into trouble right away if we take in a partner. He believes in drinking beer and smoking cigarettes, and doing things of that sort. Now if he as a partner introduces anything of the kind, what are we to do?" "Sure enough!" The tone expressed conviction, but not relief. "Then what are we to do, Jerry? I don't see how we are going to help Norm any." "I do, quite as well as though he was a partner. Norm is a good natured fellow; he likes to help people. I think he likes to do things for others better than for himself. If we explain to him that we want to go into this business, and that you can't wait on customers because you are a girl, and it wouldn't be the thing, and I can't because it is in your house, and I promised my father I would spend my evenings at home and write a piece of a letter to him every evening, and ask him to come to the rescue and keep the room open, and sell the things for us, don't you believe he will be twice as likely to do it as though we made him as young as ourselves and tried to be his equals?" Then Nettie's face was bright. "What a contriver you are!" she said admiringly. "I think that will do just splendidly." She was right; it did. Norm might have curled his lip and said "pooh" to the scheme, had he been placed on an equality; for he was getting to the age when to be considered young, or childish, is a crime in a boy's eyes. But to be appealed to as one who could help the young fry out of their dilemma, and at the same time provide himself with a very pleasant place to stay, and very congenial employment while he stayed, was quite to Norm's mind. And as it was an affair of the children's, he made no suggestions about beer or cigars. It is true he thought of them, but he thought at once that neither Nettie nor Jerry would probably have anything to do with them, and as he had no dignity to sustain, he decided to not even mention the matter. These two planned really better than they knew in appealing to Norm for help. His curious pride would never have allowed him to say to a boy, "We keep cakes and coffee for sale at our house. Come in and try them." But it was entirely within the line of his ideas of respectability to say, "What do you think those two young ones over at our house have thought up next? They have opened an eating house, cakes and things such as my sister can make, and coffee, dirt cheap. I've promised to run the thing for them in the evening awhile. I suppose you'll patronize them?" And the boys, who would have sneered at his setting himself up in business, answered, "What, the little chap who lives at Smith's? And your little sister? Ho, what a notion! I don't know but it is a bright one, though, as sure as you live. There isn't a spot in this town where a fellow can get a decent bite unless he pays his week's wages for it. Boys, let's go around and see what the little chaps are about." The very first evening was a success. Nettie had assured herself that she must not be disappointed if no one came, at first. "You see, it is a new thing," she explained to her mother. "Of course it will take them a little while to get acquainted with it. If nobody at all comes to night, I shall not be disappointed. Shall you, Jerry?" "Why, yes," said Jerry, "I should; because I know of one boy who is coming, and is going to have a ginger snap and a glass of milk; and that is little Ted Locker, who lives down the lane. They about starved that boy. I shall like to see him get something good. He has 3 cents, and I assured him he could get a brimming glass of milk and a ginger snap for that. He was as delighted as possible." "Poor fellow!" said Nettie. "I mean to tell Norm to let him have 2 snaps. Wouldn't you?" And Jerry agreed, not stopping to explain that he had furnished the 3 cents with which Ted was to treat his poor little stomach. So the work began in benevolence. Still Nettie was anxious, not to say nervous. "You will have to eat soft gingerbread at your house for breakfast, dinner, and supper, I am afraid," she said to Jerry with a half laugh, as they stood looking at it. "I don't know why I made 4 tins of it. I seemed to get in a gale when I was making it." "Never you fear," said Jerry, cheerily. "I'll be willing to eat such gingerbread as that 3 times a day for a week. Between you and me," lowering his voice, "Sarah Ann can't make very good gingerbread. When we get such a run of custom that we have none left over to sell, I wish you'd teach her how." I do not know that any member of the two households could be said to be more interested in the new enterprise than Mr. Decker. He helped set up the shelves, and he made a little corner shelf on purpose for the lamp, and he watched the entire preparations with an interest which warmed Nettie's heart. I haven't said anything about Mr. Decker during these days, because I found it hard to say. You are acquainted with him as a sour-faced, unreasonable, beer-drinking man; when suddenly he became a man who said "Good morning" when he came into the room, and who sat down smooth-shaven, and with quiet eyes and smile, to his breakfast, and spoke gently to Susie when she tipped her cup of water over, and kissed little Sate when he lifted her to her seat, and waited for Mrs. Decker to bring the coffee pot, then bowed his head, and in clear tones asked a blessing on the food, how am I to describe him to you? The change was something which even Mrs. Decker, who watched him every minute he was in the house, and thought of him all day long, could not get accustomed to. It astonished her so to think that she, Mrs. Decker, lived in a house where there was a prayer made every night and morning, and where each evening after supper Nettie read a few verses in the Bible, and her father prayed; that every time she passed her own mother's Bible, which had been brought out of its hiding place in an old trunk, she said, under her breath, "Thank the Lord." No, she did not understand it, the marvelous change which had come over her husband. She had known him as a kind man; he had been that when she married him, and for a few months afterwards. She had heard him speak pleasantly to Norm, and show him much attention; he had done it before they were married, and for a while afterwards; but there was a look in his face, and a sound in his voice now, such as she had never seen nor heard before. "It isn't Decker," she said in a burst of confidence to Nettie. "He is just as good as he can be, and I don't know anything in the world he ain't willing to do for me, or for any of us; and it is beautiful, the whole of it. But it is all new. I used to think if the man I married could only come back to me, I should be perfectly happy; but I don't know this man at all. He seems to me sometimes most like an angel." Probably you would have laughed at this. Joe Decker did not look in the least like the picture you have in your mind of an angel. But perhaps if you had known him only a few weeks before, as Mrs. Decker did, and could have seen the wonderful change in him which she saw, the contrast might even have suggested angels. Nettie understood it. She struggled with her timidity and her ignorance of just what ought to be said. Then she made her earnest reply. "Mother, I'll tell you the difference. Father prays, and when people pray, you know, and mean it, as he does, they get to looking very different." But Mrs. Decker did not pray. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Too good to be true. As a matter of fact, there wasn't a cake left, neither doughnut nor ginger snap, hardly a crumb to tell the successful tale. Nettie surveyed the empty shelves the next morning in astonishment. She had been too busy the night before to realize how fast things were going. Naturally, the number and variety of dishes in the Decker household was limited, and the evening to Nettie was a confused murmur of, "Hand us some more cups," "Can't you raise a few more teaspoons somewhere?" "Give us another plate," or "More doughnuts needed," and Nettie flew hither and thither, washed cups, rinsed spoons, said, "What did I do with that towel?" or "Where in the world is the bread knife?" or "Oh, I smell the coffee, maybe it is boiling over," and was conscious of nothing but weariness and relief when the last cup of coffee was drank and the last teaspoon washed. But with the next morning's sunshine, she knew the opening was a success. She counted the gains with eager joy, assuring Jerry that they could have twice as much gingerbread next time. "And you'll need it," said Norm. "I had to tell half a dozen boys that there wasn't a crumb left. I felt sorry for 'em, too. They were boarding house fellows who never get anything decent to eat." Already Norm had apparently forgotten that he was one who used frequently to make a similar complaint. There was a rarely sweet smile on Nettie's face, not born of the chink in the factory bag which she had made for the money. It grew from the thought that she need not hide the bag now, and tremble lest it should be taken to the saloon to pay for whiskey. What a little time ago it was that she had feared that! What a changed world it was! "But there won't be such a crowd again," she said, as they were putting the room in order. "That was the first night." "Humph!" said that wise woman Susie, with a significant toss of her head. "Last night you said we mustn't expect anybody because it was the first night." Then "the firm" had a hearty laugh at Nettie's expense, and set to work preparing for evening. I am not going to tell you the story of that summer and fall. It was beautiful, as any of the Deckers will tell you with eager eyes and voluble voice if you call on them and start the subject. The business grew and grew, and exceeded their most sanguine expectations. Mr. Decker interested himself in it most heartily, and brought often an old acquaintance to get a cup of coffee. "Make it good and strong," he would say to Nettie in an earnest whisper. "He's thirsty, and I brought him here instead of going for beer. I wish the room was larger, and I'd get others to come." In time, and indeed in a very short space of time, this grew to be the crying need of the firm. "If we only had more room and more dishes!" There was a certain long, low building which had once been used as a boarding house for the factory hands, before that institution grew large and moved into new quarters, and which was not now in use. At this building Jerry and Nettie, and for that matter Norm, looked with longing eyes. They named it "our rooms," and hardly ever passed that they did not suggest some improvement in it which could be easily made, and which would make it just the thing for their business. They knew just what sort of curtains they would have at the windows, just what furnishings in front and back rooms, just how many lamps would be needed. "We will have a hanging lamp over the center table," said Jerry, "one of those new fashioned things which shine and give a bright light, almost like gas, and lots of books and papers for the boys to read." "But where would we get the books and papers?" would Nettie say with an anxious business face, as though the room and the table and the hanging lamp were arranged for, and the last mentioned articles all that were needed to complete the list. "Oh, they would gather little by little. I know some people who would donate great piles of them if we had a place to put them. For that matter, as it is, father is going to send us some picture papers, a great bundle of them. Send them by express, and we must have a table to put them on." So the plans grew, but constantly they looked at the long, low building, and said what a nice place it would be. One morning Jerry came across the yard with a grave face. "What do you think?" he said, the moment he caught sight of Nettie. "They have gone and rented our rooms for a horrid old saloon; whiskey in front and gambling in the back part. Isn't it a shame that they have got ahead of us in just that kind of way?" "Oh, dear me!" said Nettie, drawing out each word to twice its usual length, and sitting down on a corner of the wood box with hands clasped over the dish towel, and for the moment a look on her face as though all was lost. But it was the very same day that Jerry appeared again, his face beaming. This time it was hard to make Nettie hear, for Mrs. Decker was washing, and mingling with the rapid rub-a-dub of the clothes was the sizzle of ham in the spider, and the bubble of a kettle which was bent on boiling over, and making the half-distracted housekeeper all the trouble it could. Yet his news was too good to keep, and he shouted above the din. "I say, Nettie, the man has backed out. Our rooms are not rented after all." "Goody!" said Nettie, and she smiled on the kettle in a way to make it think she did not care if anything in it boiled over on the floor; whereupon it calmed down, of course, and behaved itself. So the weeks passed, and the enterprise grew and flourished. I hope you remember Mrs. Speckle? Very early in the autumn she sent every one of her chicks out into the world to toil for themselves, and began business. Each morning a good sized, yellow tinted, warm, beautiful egg lay in the nest waiting for Jerry; and when he came, Mrs. Speckle cackled the news to him in the most interested way. "She couldn't do better if she were a regularly constituted member of the firm with a share in the profits," said Jerry. The egg was daily carried to Mrs. Farley's, where there was an invalid daughter who had a fancy for that warm, plump egg which came to her each morning, done up daintily in pink cotton and laid in a box just large enough for it. But there came a morning which was a proud one to Nettie. Jerry had returned from Mrs. Farley's with news. "The sick daughter is going South. She has an auntie who is to spend the winter in Florida, so they have decided to send her. They start to-morrow morning. Mrs. Farley said they would take our eggs all the same, and she wished Miss Helen could have them; but somebody else would have to eat them for her." Then Nettie, beaming with pleasure: "Jerry, I wish you would tell Mrs. Farley that we can't spare them any more at present. I would have told you before, but I didn't want to take the egg from Miss Helen. I want to buy them now, every other morning, for mother and father. Mother thinks there is nothing nicer than a fresh egg, and I know father will be pleased." What satisfaction was in Nettie's voice, what joy in her heart! Oh, they were poor, very poor, miserably poor, Lorena Barstow called them, but they had already reached the point where Nettie felt justified in planning for a fresh egg apiece for father and mother, and knew that it could be paid for. So Mrs. Speckle began from that day to keep the results of her industry in the home circle, and grew more important because of that. Almost every day now brought surprises. One of the largest of them was connected with Susie Decker. That young woman from the very first had shown a commendable interest in everything pertaining to the business. She patiently did errands for it in all sorts of weather, and was always ready to dust shelves, arrange cookies without eating so much as a bite, and even wipe teaspoons, a task which she used to think beneath her. "If you can't trust me with things that would smash," she used to say with scornful gravity to Nettie, "then you can't expect me to be willing to wipe those tough spoons." But in these days spoons were taken uncomplainingly. Susie had a business head, and was already learning to count pennies and add them to the 5 and 10 cent pieces. And when Jerry said approvingly, "One of these days she will be our treasurer," the faintest shadow of a blush would appear on Susie's face, but she always went on counting gravely, with an air of one who had not heard a word. On a certain stormy, windy day, one of November's worst, it was discovered late in the afternoon that the molasses jug was empty, and the boys had been promised some molasses candy that very evening. "What shall we do?" asked Nettie, looking perplexed, and standing jug in hand in the middle of the room. "Jerry won't be home in time to get it, and I can't leave those cakes to bake themselves. Mother, you don't think you could see to them a little while I run to the grocery, do you?" Mrs. Decker shook her head, but spoke sympathetically. "I'd do it in a minute, child, or I'd go for the molasses, but these shirts are very particular. I never had such fine ones to iron before, and the irons are just right, and if I should have to leave the bosoms at the wrong minute to look at the cakes, why, it would spoil the bosoms; and on the other hand, if I left the cakes and saved the bosoms, why, they would be spoiled." This seemed logical reasoning. Susie, perched on a high chair in front of the table, was counting a large pile of pennies, putting them in heaps of 25 cents each. She waited until her fourth heap was complete, then looked up. "Why don't you ask me to go?" "Sure enough," said Nettie, laughing. "I'd ask you in a minute if it didn't rain so hard. But it seems a pretty stormy day to send out a little chicken like you." "I'm not a chicken, and I'm not the least bit afraid of rain. I can go as well as not if you only think so." "I don't believe it will hurt her," said Mrs. Decker, glancing doubtfully out at the sullen sky. "It doesn't rain so hard as it did, and she has such a nice thick sack now." It was nice, made of heavy waterproof cloth, with a lovely woolly trimming going all around it. Susie liked that sack almost better than anything else in the world. Her mother had bought it second hand of a woman whose little girl had outgrown it. The mother had washed all day and ironed another day to pay for it, and felt the liveliest delight in seeing Susie in the pretty garment. The rain seemed to be quieting a little, so presently the young woman was robed in sack and waterproof bonnet with a cape, and started on her way. Halfway to the grocery she met Jerry hastening home from school with a bag of books slung across his shoulder. "Is it so late as that?" asked Susie in dismay. "Nettie thought you wouldn't be at home in a good while. The candy won't get done." "No, it is as early as this," he answered, laughing. "We were dismissed an hour earlier than usual this afternoon. Where are you going? After molasses? See here, suppose you give me the jug and you take my books and scud home. There is a big storm coming on. I think the wind is going to blow, and I'm afraid it will twist you all up and pour the molasses over you. Then you'd be ever so sticky." Susie laughed, and exchanged not unwillingly the heavy jug for the books. There had been quite wind enough since she started, and if there was to be more, she had no mind to brave it. "If you hurry," called Jerry, "I think you'll get home before the next squall comes." So she hurried. But Jerry was mistaken. The squall came with all its force, and poor small Susie was twisted and whirled and lost her breath almost, and panted and struggled on, and was only too thankful that she hadn't the molasses jug. Nearly opposite the Farley home, their side door suddenly opened and a pleasant voice called, "Little girl, come in here and wait until the shower is over. You will be wet to the skin." It is true, Susie did not believe that her waterproof sack could be wet through, but that dreadful wind so frightened her, twisting the trees as it did, that she was glad to obey the kind voice and rush into shelter. "Why, it is Nettie's sister, I do believe," said Ermina Farley, helping her off with the dripping hood. "You dear little mousie, what sent you out in such a storm?" Miss Susie, not liking the idea of being a mouse much more than she did of being a chicken, answered with dignity and becoming brevity. "Molasses candy!" said Mrs. Farley, laughing, yet with an undertone of disapproval in her voice which keen-minded Susie heard and felt. "I shouldn't think that was a necessity of life on such a day as this." "It is if you have promised it to some boys who don't ever have anything nice, only what they get at our house; and who save their pennies that they spend on beer and cider and cigars to get it." Wise Susie, indignation in every word, yet well controlled and aware before she finished her sentence that she was deeply interesting her audience. How they questioned her! What was this? Who did it? Who thought of it? When did they begin it? Who came? How did they get the money to buy their things? Susie, thoroughly posted, thoroughly in sympathy with the entire movement, calm, collected, keen far beyond her years, answered clearly and well. Plainly she saw that this lady in a silken gown was interested. "Well, if this isn't a revelation!" said Mrs. Farley at last. "A Young Men's Christian Association not only, but an eating house flourishing right in our midst, and we knowing nothing about it! Did you ever know anything of it, daughter?" "No, ma'am," said Ermina, "but I knew that splendid Nettie was trying to do something for her brother; and that nice boy who used to bring eggs was helping her. It is just like them both. I don't believe there is a nicer girl in town than Nettie Decker." Mrs. Farley seemed unable to give up the subject. She asked many questions as to how long the boys stayed, and what they did all the time. Susie explained. "Well, they eat, you know, and Norm doesn't hurry them. He says they have to pitch the things down fast where they board, to keep them from freezing; and our room is warm because we keep the kitchen door open, and the heat goes in. But we don't know what we shall do when the weather gets real cold. And after they have eaten all the things they can pay for, they look at the pictures. Jerry's father sends him picture papers, and Mr. Sherrill brings some, most every day. Miss Sherrill is coming Thanksgiving night to sing for them, and Nettie says if we only had an organ she would play beautiful music. We want to give them a treat for Thanksgiving; we mean to do it without any pay at all if we can; and father thinks we can because he is working nights this week, and getting extra pay; and Jerry thinks there will be 2 chickens ready, and Nettie wishes we could have an organ for a little while, just for Norm, because he loves music so; but of course we can't." Long before this sentence was finished, Ermina and her mother had exchanged glances, which Susie, being intent on her story, did not see. She was a wise little woman of business. What if Mrs. Farley should say, "Well, I will give you a chicken myself for the Thanksgiving time, and a whole pack of apples?" Then, indeed, Susie believed that her joy would be complete; for Nettie had said, if they could only afford 3 chickens, she believed that with a lot of crust she could make chicken pie enough for them each to have a large piece, hot; not all the boys, of course, but the 7 or 8 who worked in Norm's shop and boarded at the dreary boarding house. They would so like to give Norm a surprise for his birthday, and have a treat, say at 6 o'clock, for all of these; for this year Thanksgiving fell on Norm's birthday. The storm held up after a little, and Susie, trudging home, a trifle disgusted with Mrs. Farley because she said not a word about a peck of apples or the other chicken, was met by Jerry coming in search of her. The molasses was boiling over, he told her, and so was her mother, with anxiety lest the wind had taken her, Susie, up in a tree, and had forgotten to bring her down again. He hurried her home between the squalls, and Susie quietly resolved to say not a word about all the things she had told at the Farley home. What if Nettie should think she hadn't been womanly to talk so much about what they were doing? If there was one thing that this young woman had a horror of during these days, it was that Nettie would think she was not womanly. The desire, nay, the determination to be so, at all costs, had well nigh cured her of her fits of rage and screaming, because in one of her calm moments Nettie had pointed out to her the fact that she never in her life heard a woman scream like that. Susie, being a logical person, argued the rest of the matter out for herself, and resolved to scream and stamp her foot no more. Great was the astonishment of the Decker family next morning. Mrs. Farley herself came to call on them. She wanted some plain ironing done that afternoon. Yes, Mrs. Decker would do it, and be glad to. It was a leisure afternoon with her. Mrs. Farley wanted something more. She wanted to know about the business in which Nettie and her young friend next door were engaged; and Susie listened breathlessly, for fear it would appear that she had told more than she ought. But Mrs. Farley kept her own counsel, only questioning Nettie closely, and at last she made a proposition that had well nigh been the ruin of the tin of cookies which Nettie was taking from the oven. She dropped the tin. "Did you burn you, child?" asked Mrs. Decker, rushing forward. "No, ma'am," said Nettie, laughing, and trying not to laugh, and wanting to cry, and being too amazed to do so. "But I was so surprised, and so almost scared, that they dropped. Oh, Mrs. Farley, we have wanted that more than anything else in the world. Ever since Mr. Sherrill saw how my brother Norman loved music, and said it might be the saving of him. Jerry and I have planned and planned, but we never thought of being able to do it for a long, long time." Yet all this joy was over an old, somewhat wheezy little house organ which stood in the second-story unused room of Mrs. Farley's house, and which she had threatened to send to the city auction rooms to get out of the way. She offered to lend it to Nettie for her "rooms," and Nettie's gratitude was so great that the blood seemed inclined to leave her face entirely for a minute, then thought better of it, and rolled over it in waves. Chapter 23 of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Crowning Wonder. And they did have the Thanksgiving supper! It seemed wonderful to Nettie, even then, and long afterwards the wonder grew, that so many things occurred about that time to help the scheme along. At first it was to be a very simple little affair. Two of the boys, Rick for instance, and Alf, invited to come in an hour or so before the room was open for the evening, and have a little supper by themselves, a chicken, and possibly some cranberry sauce if she could compass it, though cranberries were very expensive at that season; and besides, they ate sugar in a way which was perfectly alarming. A pie of some sort she had quite set her heart on; but whether it would be pumpkin or not depended on how they succeeded in saving up for extra milk. The circumstances of the Deckers were changing steadily, but when a man was tumbled to the foot of a hill, and lain there quite a while, it is generally a slow process to get up and climb back to where he was before. Mr. Decker's wages were good, and in time he expected to be able to support his family in at least ordinary comfort; but when he came fully to his senses, he stood for a while appalled before the number of things which had been sold to pay his bill at the saloon, and the number of things which in the meantime had worn out, and not been replaced by new ones. Then the rent was 2 months back, and Job Smith had been all that stood between him and a home. There was a great deal to do if the Deckers were to get back to the place from which they began to roll down hill; so extra expenses for cranberries, or even milk, were not to be thought of, if they must be drawn from the family funds. The business of the firm was flourishing, but you must remember that the central feature of the enterprise was to keep prices very low, lower than beer and bad cigars, and the enterprise of the dealers in those things is so great that if you are willing to put up with the meanest sorts you can always get them very low indeed. To compete with them, Jerry and Nettie had to study the most rigid economy to keep their shelves supplied, and even to sometimes "shut their eyes and make a reckless dash at apples or peanuts, regardless of expense." This was the way in which Jerry occasionally apologized for an extra quantity of these luxuries. Still, in the most interesting ways the Thanksgiving supper grew. Mrs. Decker secured within a week of the time an unexpected ironing which she could do in 2 evenings, and she it was who proposed the wild scheme of having 2 chickens and having them hot, and stuffing them with bread crumbs as she used to do years ago, and having gravy and some baked potatoes. She agreed to furnish the extra potatoes, and a few turnips, just to make it feel like Thanksgiving. Nettie was astonished, but pleased. It would be more work, but what of that? Think of being able to make a real supper for Norm's birthday! Then Mrs. Smith at just the right moment had a present of 2 pumpkins from her country friends. As they could never make away with 2 pumpkins before they would spoil, of course the Deckers must take part of one at least. About that time the minister bought a cow. And what did he do but come himself one night to know if Mrs. Decker had any use for skimmed milk. They were very fond of cream at their house, and skimmed milk gathered faster than they knew what to do with it. "Any use for skim milk!" Mrs. Decker could only repeat the words in a kind of ecstasy at her good luck, and she almost wondered that the yellow pumpkin standing behind the door in the closet did not laugh outright. But the crowning wonder came, after all, on the morning before the eventful day. Jake, the Farleys' man of all work, brought it in a basket, which was large and closely covered, and very heavy looking. It was left at the door with Susie, who went to answer the knock, for Miss Nettie. Susie repeated the name with a lingering tone, as though she liked the sound of the unusual prefix. Then they gathered about the basket. A great solemn looking turkey with a note in his mouth which said, "A Thanksgiving token for Nettie, from her friend, Ermina Farley." A turkey in the Decker oven! Mr. Decker surveyed the great fellow in silence for a few minutes, then said impressively, "If we don't have a new cook stove before another Thanksgiving Day comes around, my name is not Decker." Mrs. Job Smith left her pies half made, and ran in a friendly way, to see the wonder; and at once remarked that he would exactly fit into their oven, and she wasn't going to cook her turkey till the day afterwards, because they had got to go to Job's uncle's for Thanksgiving. So that matter was settled. It was then that the Deckers decided to make a reckless plunge into society, and invite every boy in Norm's shop to a 3 o'clock dinner, with turkey and cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie and turnip, and all the rest. What a day it was! They grew nearly wild in their efforts to keep all the secrets from Norm, and act as though nothing unusual was happening. Especially was this the case after the morning express brought a package for Nettie from her dear old home, with 2 mince pies, and a box of Auntie Marshall's doughnuts, and a bag of nuts, and as much as 2 pounds of the loveliest candy she ever saw, sent by the young man of the home who was clerk in a wholesale confectioner's. It took Mrs. Decker and Nettie not 5 minutes to resolve, looking curiously into each other's faces the while, to see if they really had become insane, that they would have a regular dessert following the dinner. "It is only once a year," said Nettie apologetically. "It is only once in 5 years," said Mrs. Decker solemnly. "I haven't had a Thanksgiving in 5 years, child, and I never expected to have another." Everybody was busy all day long. Mrs. Smith was in and out, helping as faithfully as though Norm was her boy, and Sarah Ann just gave herself up to the importance of the occasion, and did not go to her uncle's at all. "I can go there any time," she said good naturedly, "or no time. They always forget that we are alive until Thanksgiving Day, and then they ask us, because they kind of think they've got to. Uncle Jed is a clerk, and his wife makes dresses for the folks on Belmont Street, and they feel stuck up 4 feet above us. I'd rather eat cold pork and potatoes at home than go there any day. I'm dreadful glad of an excuse that father thinks is worth giving." Susie was a young woman of importance that day. Nettie, who had discovered exactly how to manage her, gave her work to do which suited her ideas of what a grown person like herself ought to be about; and when she wanted the table cleared from the picture papers of the night before, instead of telling Miss Susie to fold them away, said, "What do you think, Susie? Would it be best for us to fold these papers away in the closet for to day, and have this table left clear for the nuts and the candies?" "Yes," said Susie, with her grown up air, "I think it would. I'll attend to it." And she did it beautifully. "It is well we have no little bits of folks around," said Nettie, when the nuts were being cracked. "They would be tempted to eat some, and then I'm afraid we would not have enough to go around." And Susie, gravely assenting to this theory, arranged the nuts in Mrs. Smith's blue saucers, an equal number of each, and ate not one. Little Sate went with Jerry to give the invitations to the boys, and to charge them to keep the whole thing a profound secret from Norm. They came home by way of the Farley woods, and little Sate appeared at the door with her arms laden with such lovely branches of autumn leaves, that Nettie exclaimed in wild delight, and left her turnips half peeled to help adorn the walls of the front room. This suggested the idea, and by 3 o'clock that room was a bower of beauty. Red and golden and lovely brown leaves mixed in with the evergreen tassels of the pines, with here and there pine cones, and red berries peeping out from everywhere. "You little darling," said Nettie, kissing Sate, "you have made a picture of it, like what they paint on canvas, only 1,000 times lovelier." And Sate, looking on, with her wide sweet eyes aglow with feeling, fitted the picture well. So the feast was spread, and the astonished and hungry boys came and feasted; and Norm, too astonished at first to take it in, began presently to understand that all this preparation and delight were in honor of his birthday; and though he said not a word, aloud, he kept up in his soul a steady line of thought, the center of which was this: "I don't deserve it, that's a fact. There's mother doing everything for me, and Nettie working like a slave, and the children going without things to give me a treat. I'll be in a better fix to keep a birthday before it gets round again, see if I'm not." His was not the only thinking which was done that day. Rick, merry enough all the afternoon, and enjoying his dinner as well as it is possible for a hungry fellow to do, nevertheless had a sober look on his face more than once, and said as he shook hands with Norm that night, "I'll tell you what it is, my boy, if I had your kind of a home, and folks, I'd be worth something in the world. I would, so. I ain't sure, between you and me, but I shall anyhow; just for the sake of getting into such Thanksgiving houses once in a while. By and by a fellow will have to carry himself pretty straight, or that sister of yours won't have nothing to do with him; I can see it in her eyes." Then he went home; and cold though his room was, he sat down, even after he had pulled off his coat, as a memory of some thoughtful word of Nettie's came over him, and went all over it again. Then he brought his hand hard down with a thud on the rickety table, on which he leaned, and said, "As sure as you live and breathe the breath of life, old fellow, you've got to turn over a new leaf; and you've got to begin to night." It was less than a week after the Thanksgiving excitements that the town got itself roused over something which reached even to the children. Jerry came home from school with it, and came directly to Nettie, his cheeks aglow with the news. "There's to be the biggest kind of a time here next Thursday, Nettie. Don't you think General McClintock is coming to give a lecture, and they are going to give him a reception at Judge Bentley's, and I don't know what all; and the schools are all going to dismiss and go down to the train in procession to meet him, and they are going to sing 'Hail to the Chief,' and the band is to play 'See, the conquering hero comes,' and I don't know what isn't going to be done." "Who is General McClintock?" said ignorant Nettie, composedly drying her plate as if all the generals in the world were nothing to her. Then did Jerry come the nearest impatience that Nettie had ever seen in him; and he launched forth in such a wild praise of General McClintock, and such an excited account of the things which he had done and said, and prevented, and pushed, that Nettie was half bewildered, and delightfully excited when he paused for breath. Henceforth the talk of the town was General McClintock. "It is a wonder they asked him to speak on temperance," said Nettie, disdain in her voice. She had not a high opinion of the temperance enthusiasm of the town in which she lived. "They didn't," said Jerry. "He asked himself. They wanted him to talk about the war, or the tariff, or the Great West, or some other stupid thing, but he said, 'No, sir, the great question of the day is temperance, and I shall speak on that or nothing.'" "How do you happen to know so much about him?" Nettie questioned one day when Jerry was at his highest pitch of excitement. "Ho!" he said, almost in scorn. "I have known about him ever since I was born. Everybody knows General McClintock." Then Nettie felt meek and ignorant. Nothing had ever so excited Jerry as the coming of a hero; and indeed the town generally seemed to have caught fire. General McClintock seemed to be the theme of every tongue. Connected with these days, Nettie had her perplexities and her sorrows. In the first place, Jerry was obstinately determined that she should join the procession with him to meet General McClintock. In vain she protested that she did not belong to the public schools. He did, he said, and that was enough. Then when Nettie urged and almost cried, he had another plan. "Well, then, we won't go as scholars. We'll go ahead as private individuals. I'm only a kind of a scholar anyhow, just holding on for a few weeks till my father comes. We'll go up there early and get a good place before the procession forms, and see the whole of it. I know the marshal real well; he's a good friend of mine, and I know he will give us a place." It was of no use for Nettie to protest; to remind him that the girls would think she was putting herself forward; to say that she had nothing to wear to such a gathering. She might as well have talked to a stone for all the impression she made. She had never seen him so resolute to have his own way. He did not care what she wore; it made not the slightest difference to him what the girls said, and he did ask it of her as a kindness to him, and he should be hurt so that he could never get over it if she refused to go. He had never wanted anything so much in his life, and he could not give it up. So Nettie, reluctant, sorrowful, promised and cried over it in her room that night. She wanted to please Jerry, for his father was coming now in a few weeks, perhaps, and Jerry would go away with him, and she would never see him again. And what in the world would she do without him? And here she cried harder than ever. Then came up that dreadful question of clothes. Her one winter dress was too short, and too narrow, and a good deal worn. Auntie Marshall had thought last winter that it would hardly do for a church dress, and here it was still her best. There was no such thing as a new one for the present; for mother had not had anything in so long, she must be clothed, and Nettie was willing to wait. But she was not willing to take a conspicuous place on a public day, and be stared at and talked about. However, Jerry continued merciless to the very last; nothing else would satisfy him. He hurried her in a breathless state down the hill to the platform, smiled and nodded to his friend the marshal, who nodded back in the most confidential manner, and perched them on the corner of the temporary platform, right behind the reception committee. It was every whit as disagreeable as Nettie had planned that it should be. Of course Lorena Barstow was among the leaders in the young people's procession, and of course she contrived to get enough to be heard, and to say in a most unnecessarily loud voice, "Do look at that Decker girl perched up there on the platform! If she doesn't contrive to make herself a laughing stock everywhere! Girls, look at her hat! She must have worn it ever since they came out of the ark! What business is she here, anyway? She doesn't belong to the schools." There was much more in the same vein; much pushing and crowding, and laughing, and hateful speeches about folks who crowded in where they didn't belong, and poor Nettie, the tears only kept back by force of will, looked in vain for sympathy into Jerry's fairly dancing eyes. What ailed the boy? She had never seen him so almost wild with eager excitement before. Judge Barstow and Dr. Lewis were both on the reception committee, of course, and under cover of this their daughters wedged their way to the front, and whispered to the fathers; loud whispers. "Papa, that ridiculous Decker girl and the little Irish boy with her ought not to be perched up there in that conspicuous place. She doesn't belong here, anyway. She isn't a scholar." Then Judge Barstow in good humored tones to Jerry: "My boy, don't you think you would find it quite as pleasant down there among the others? This little girl doesn't want to be up here, I am sure. Suppose you both go down and fall behind the procession. You can see the General when the carriage passes; it is to be thrown open so every one can see." Then the marshal: "If you please, Judge Barstow, it won't do for them to try to get through now; the crowd is so great they might be hurt. There is plenty of room where they stand; they will do no harm." Now the tears must come from the indignant eyes. No, they shall not. Jerry doesn't even wink; he only laughs, in the highest good humor. Has Jerry gone wild with excitement? "It will all be over in 2 minutes," explains Judge Barstow. "He wished to drive directly to his hotel, and have perfect quiet for 2 hours. He declined to be entertained at a private house or to say a word at the depot. I suppose he is fatigued, and doesn't like to trust his voice to speak in the open air; so the committee are to shake hands with him as rapidly as possible, and show him to his carriage, and not wait on him for 2 hours. He has ordered a private dinner at the Kepler House." Suddenly there is the whistle of the train, the band plays "See, the Conquering Hero Comes." With the second strain the train comes to a halt, and a tall, broad shouldered man with iron gray hair and a military air all about him steps from the platform amid the cheers of thousands. Now, indeed, was some excuse for Lorena Barstow's loud exclamations of disapproval. There was Jerry, pushing his way among the throng, holding so firmly all the while to Nettie's hand that escape was impossible; pushing even past the reception committee, notwithstanding the detaining hand of Judge Barstow, who says: "See here, my boy, you are impudent; did you know it?" "I beg pardon," says Jerry respectfully, but he slips past him, just as General McClintock with curious words is thanking the committee of reception, declining their pressing personal invitations, his eyes meantime roving over the crowd in search of something, or somebody. Suddenly they melt with a tenderness which does not belong to the soldier, and the firm lips quiver as his voice says, "Oh, my boy!" and Jerry the Irish boy flings himself into General McClintock's arms, and the world stands agape. Just a second, and his hand holds firmly to the sack which covers Nettie's startled frightened form, then he releases himself and turns to her. "Father, this is Nettie." "Sure enough," said the General, and his tall head bends, and the mustached lips of the old soldier touch Nettie's cheek, and the cheering, hushed for a second, breaks forth afresh. It is a moment of the wildest excitement. Even then Nettie tries to break away and is held fast. And an officer of the day advances with the military salute and assures the General that his carriage is in waiting. And the General himself hands the bewildered Nettie in, with a friendly smile and an assuring, "Of course you must go. My boy planned this whole thing 3 months ago. And you and I must carry out his program to the letter." Then Jerry springs like a cat into the carriage, and the scholars sing "Hail to the Chief," and the carriage, drawn by 4 horses, rolls down the road made wide for it by the Home Guard in full uniform, and the General lifts his hat and bows right and left, and smiles on Nettie Decker sitting by his side, and almost devours with his hungry, fatherly eyes her friend, the Irish boy, on the opposite seat. and the scholars almost forget to sing, in their great and ever-increasing amazement. Chapter 24 of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy. The Past and Present. Nettie Decker sat by the window of her father's house, looking out into the beautiful world, taking one last look at the flowers, and the trees, and the lawn, and all the beautiful and familiar things; saying good bye to them, for in a brief 2 hours she was to leave them and the old home. She is Nettie Decker still, but you will not be able to say that of her in another hour. She has changed somewhat since you last saw her in her blue gingham dress a trifle faded, or in her brown merino much the worse for time. To day she is 20 years old; a lovely summer day, and her birthday is to be celebrated by making it her wedding day. The blue gingham has been long gone; so has the brown merino. The dress she wears to day looks unlike either of them. It is white, all white. She has a suitable dress at last for a gala day. Soft, rich, quiet white silk. Long and full and pure, not a touch of trimming about it anywhere. Not even a flower yet, though she holds one in her hand in doubt whether she will add it to the whiteness. I think it will probably be pushed among the folds of soft lace which lie across her bosom, for that would please little Sate's artist eye, and Nettie likes to please Sate. While she sits there, watching the birds and the flowers, and thinking of the strange sweet past, and the strange sweet present, there pass by almost underneath the window 2 young ladies, moving slowly, glancing up curiously at the open casement, from which Nettie draws a little back, that she may not be seen. "That is Nettie's room where the window is open," says one of the ladies. "It is a lovely room. I was in it once when the circle met there. It is furnished in blue, with creamy tints on the walls and furniture. I don't think I ever saw a prettier room. Nettie has excellent taste." "Do you say her brother is to be at the wedding?" "Oh, yes, indeed. He came day before yesterday. He is a splendid looking fellow, and smart. They say he is the finest student Yale has had for years. He graduated with the very highest honors, and now he is studying medicine. I heard Dr. Hobart say that he would be an honor to the profession. You ought to hear him play. I thought he would be a musician, he is so fond of music, and really he plays exquisitely on the organ. Last spring when he was home he played in church all day, and I heard ever so many people say they had never heard anything finer in any church." "I don't remember him. Was he in our set?" "Oh, no, he wasn't in any set when you were here. Why, Irene Lewis, you must remember the Deckers. They weren't in any set." "Oh, I remember them, of course. Don't you know what fun we used to make of Nettie? Didn't we call her Nan? I remember she always wore an old blue and white gingham to Sunday school." "That was years ago. She dresses beautifully now, and in exquisite taste. She must make a lovely bride. I would like to get a glimpse of her." "The McClintocks are very rich, I have been told." "Oh, immensely so, and they say General McClintock just idolizes Nettie. I don't wonder at it. She is a perfectly lovely girl." "Seems to me, Lorena, my dear, about the time I left this part of the world you did not think so much of her as you do now. I remember you used to make all sorts of fun of her, and real hateful speeches, as schoolgirls will, you know. I have a distinct recollection of a flower party where she was, and my conscience, I remember, troubled me at the time for saying so many disagreeable things about her that afternoon; but I recollect I comforted myself with the thought that you were much worse than I. You used to lead off in those days, you know." "Oh, I remember. I was a perfect little idiot in those days. Yes, I was disagreeable enough to Nettie Decker. If she hadn't been a real sweet girl, she would never have forgotten it; but I don't believe she ever thinks of it, and really she is so utterly changed, and all the family are, that I hardly ever remember her as the same girl." What became of that little Irish boy she used to be so fond of? Jerry, his name was?" "Now, Irene Lewis! You don't mean to tell me you have never heard about him! Well, you have been out of the world, sure enough." "I have never heard a word of him from the time I went with Uncle Lawrence out West. Father moved in the spring, you know, so instead of my coming back early in the spring as I expected, I never came until now. What about Jerry? Did he distinguish himself in any way? I always thought him a fine looking boy." "That is too funny that you shouldn't know. Why, the Irish boy, Jerry, as you call him, is the Gerald McClintock whom Nettie Decker is to marry at 12 o'clock to day." "Gerald McClintock! How can that be? The boy's name was Jerry Mack." "Indeed it wasn't. We were all deceived in that boy. It does seem so strange that you never heard the story. Why, you see, he was General McClintock's son all the time." "Why did he pretend he was somebody else?" "He didn't pretend. Or at least I heard he said he didn't begin it. It seems that Mrs. Smith, the carman's wife, you know, used to live in General McClintock's family before his wife died, and Job Smith lived there as coachman. When they married, General McClintock broke up housekeeping and went South with his family. Then Mrs. McClintock died, and the General and this one boy boarded in New York, and Gerald attended school. In the spring the General was called to California on some important law business. You know he is a celebrated lawyer, and they say his son is going to be even more brilliant than his father. Well, the father had to go, and the boy made him promise that he might spend the summer vacation with Mrs. Smith out here. The McClintocks had been very fond of her and her husband, and trusted them both; so the General agreed to it, thinking he would be back long before the vacation closed. But he was delayed by one thing and another, and the boy coaxed to stay on, and study in the public school here. He was a pupil in Whately Institute at home. Imagine him taking up with our common schools! So he stayed until the 1st of December, and then his father came. Such a time as that was! You see we all knew of General McClintock, of course, and when it was found we could get him to lecture, the people nearly went wild over it. We couldn't understand why we should have such good fortune, when we knew ever so many places, large cities, had been refused; but it was all explained after he came. It was a beautiful day when he came; all the schools were closed, and we formed a procession and marched to the depot, and the band was there, and great crowds. I remember as though it were yesterday how astonished we were to see Nettie Decker and that boy in a conspicuous place on the corner of the platform. Nettie had on her old brown merino, and looked so queer and seemed so out of place, that I went and spoke to father about it, and he advised them to go down and join the procession; but it seems the marshal knew what he was about, and objected to their moving. Then the train came, and there was a great excitement, and in the midst of it the General almost took that boy Jerry in his arms, and kissed him. Then he kissed Nettie Decker, and while we stood wondering what on earth it all meant, they all three entered an elegant carriage drawn by 4 horses, and were carried to the Kepler house. They had an elegant private dinner, they three; and in fact all the time the General was here he kept Nettie Decker with him. He treated her more like a daughter than a stranger. I don't think there was ever such an excitement in this town about anything as we had at that time. The circumstances were so peculiar, you know." "But I don't understand it yet. Why did he call himself Jerry Mack? What was his object in deceiving us all?" "He hadn't the slightest intention of doing so. I heard he said such a thought never entered his mind until we began it. It seems when he was a little bit of a fellow he tried to speak his name, Gerald McClintock, and the nearest he could approach to it was Jerry Mack. Of course they thought it was cunning, and it grew to be his pet name; so before they knew it the servants and all his boy friends called him so all the time. When he came here Mrs. Smith and her husband naturally used the old name. Then somebody, I'm sure I don't know who, started the story that he was an Irish boy working at the Smiths for his board; and it seems he heard of it, and it amused him so much he decided to let people think so if they wanted to. he coaxed the Smiths not to tell who he was, or why he was here. And they so nearly worshipped him, that if he had asked them to say he was a North American Indian, I believe they would have done it. It seems he liked Nettie Decker from the first, and was annoyed because she wasn't invited in our set. But I am sure I don't know how we were to blame. She had nothing to wear, and how were we to know that she was a very smart girl, and real sweet and good? The Deckers were very poor, and Mr. Decker drank, you know, and Norm was sort of a loafer, and we thought they were real low people." "I remember Ermina Farley was friendly with Nettie, and with the boy, too." "Oh, yes, Ermina was always peculiar. She is yet. I have always thought that perhaps Ermina knew something about the McClintocks, but she says she didn't. I heard her say the other day that somebody told her he was an Irish boy whose father had run away and left him, and the Smiths gave him a home out of pity; and she supposed of course it was so, and was sorry for him. Then she always thought he was handsome and smart. Well, so did I must say." "I wonder who started that absurd story about his father deserting him?" "I don't know, I'm sure. Somebody imagined it was so, I suppose, and spoke of it. Such things spread, you know, nobody seems to understand quite how." "Well, as I remember things, Jerry, I shall always call him by that name, I don't believe I could remember to say Mr. McClintock if I should meet him now, as I remember him, he seemed to be as poor as Nettie. He dressed very well, but not as a gentleman's son, and he seemed to be contriving ways to earn little bits of money. Don't you remember that old hen and chickens he bought? And he used to go to the Farleys every morning with a fresh egg for Helen; sold it, you know, for I was there one morning when Mrs. Farley paid him." "I know it. He was always contriving ways to earn money. Why, Irene, don't you remember his selling fish to Ermina Farley that day when we were talking down by the pond? I have always thought he heard more than we imagined he did that day. I don't clearly remember what we said, but I know we were running on about Nettie Decker and about Jerry. I used to sort of dislike them both, because Ermina Farley was always trying to push them forward. I would give something to know exactly what we did say that day. For a while I did not like to meet any of the McClintocks. It always seemed to me as though they were thinking about that time. But they have been perfectly polite and cordial to me, always; and Nettie Decker is a perfect lady. But I know all about the poverty. It seems the boy Jerry had been very fond of giving away money, and books, and all sorts of things to people whom he thought needed them, and his father began to be afraid he would have no knowledge of the value of money, and would give carelessly, you know, just because he felt like it. So the General had a long talk with him, and made an arrangement that while he was gone West, Jerry should have nothing to give away but what he earned. He might earn as much as he liked, or could, and give it all away if he chose, but not a penny besides, and he was not to appeal to his father to help anybody in any way whatever. Of course the father was to pay all his bills for necessary things; they say he paid a splendid price to the Smiths for taking care of him. Poor Mrs. Smith cried when he went away, as though he had been her own child. Well, of course that crippled him, in his pocket money, but they say his father was very much pleased to find how many schemes he had started for earning money. That plan about the business was his from beginning to end, and just see what it has grown to." "What? I don't know. Remember, I only came night before last, and haven't heard anything about the town since the day I left it." "Why, the Norman House, the most elegant hotel in town, is the outgrowth of that enterprise begun in the Deckers' front room. Mr. Decker owns the whole thing now, and manages it splendidly. His wife is a perfect genius, they say, about managing. She oversees the housekeeping herself, and the cooking is perfect, they say. General McClintock was so pleased with the beginning, that he bought that long low building on Smith Street that first time he was here, and fitted it up for Norman and Nettie to run. He carried his son away with him, of course, but they stayed long enough to see the matter fairly under way. The Norman House is managed on the same general principles; strictly temperance, of course. The General is as great a fanatic about that as the Deckers are, and the prices are very low. Lower than other first-class houses, while the table is better and the rooms are beautifully furnished. They say it is because Mrs. Decker is such an excellent manager that they can afford things at such low prices. Then, besides, there is a lunch room for young men where they can get excellent things for just what they cost. That is a sort of benevolence. General McClintock devotes a certain amount to it each year. And there is a splendid young man in charge of the room. You saw him once. Rick Walker, his name is. He used to be considered a sort of hard boy, but there isn't a more respected young man in town than he. He is bookkeeper at the Norman House, and has the oversight of this home dining room. You ought to go in there, and it is very nicely furnished, and they have flowers, plants, you know, and birds, and a fountain, and pictures on the walls, and for 15 cents you can get an excellent dinner. Everybody likes Rick Walker. They say he has a great influence over the boys in town, almost as great as Norman Decker. He used to be in charge of it all before he went to college." "Still, I shouldn't think the McClintocks would have liked Nettie Decker to be in quite so public a place," interrupted her listener. "Oh, she isn't public. Why, she went to New York to a private school the very next winter after the General came home. She boarded with them. The General's sister came East with him, and was the lady of the house. Then he sent her to Wellesley, you know. Didn't you know that? She graduated at Wellesley a year ago. Yes, the McClintocks educated her, or began it. Her father has done so well that I suppose he hasn't needed their help lately. He is a master builder, you know, and keeps at his business, and owns and manages this hotel besides. Oh, they are well off. You ought to see Mrs. Decker. She is a very pretty woman, and a real lady. They say Nettie and Norman are so proud of her. What was I telling you? Oh, about the room. They have a library connected with it, and a reading room, and everything complete. It is such a nice thing for our young men. A great many wealthy gentlemen contribute to the library. There is a little alcove at the further end of the reading room where they keep cake and lemonade, and nuts and little things of all sorts. They are very cheap, but the boys can't get any cigars there. I'm so glad of that. The Norman House is in very great favor, quite the fashion, and it makes such a difference with the boys who are just beginning to imagine themselves young men, and who want to be manly, to have an elegant place like that frown on all such things. My brother Dick, you remember him? He was a little fellow when you lived here. He went into the Norman House one day and called for a cigar. He was just beginning to smoke, and I suppose he did it because it would sound manly. It was in the spring when Norman was at home on vacation, and it seems he expressed so much astonishment that Dick was quite ashamed. I don't think he has smoked a cigar since." "The Deckers seem to be quite a centre of interest in town." "Well, they are. They are a sort of exceptional family, some way. Their experience has been so romantic. Mr. Decker has become such a nice man. Deacon Decker, he is, a prominent man in church and everywhere. Oh, do you remember those two cunning little girls? I always thought they were sweet. Susie is a perfect lady. She is going with Nettie and her husband to Washington. But little Sate is a beauty. They say she is going to be a poet and an artist, and she looks almost like an angel. General McClintock admires her very much. He says she shall have the finest art teachers in Europe. I never saw a family come up as they did, from nothing, you may say. But then it was all owing to that fortunate accident of being friends with Gerald McClintock, and having the Farleys interested in them. Did I tell you Norman was engaged to Ermina Farley? Oh, yes, they will marry as soon as he graduates from the medical college, and then he will take her abroad and take a postgraduate course in medicine there. I suppose they will take Sate with them then. They say that is the plan. No, I certainly never saw anything like their success in life. Mrs. Smith doesn't believe in luck, you know, nor much in money, though since her Job has a position in the Norman House that pays better than carding, they have built an addition to their house, and, Sarah Ann says, live like folks. She is housekeeper at the Norman House, Mrs. Decker's right-hand woman. Mrs. Smith says the Lord had a great deal to do with the Decker family; that Nettie came home resolved to be faithful to him, and to trust him to save her father and brother, and so he did it, of course. It seems she and Jerry promised each other to work for Norman and the father in every possible way until they were converted. And they did. I must say I think they are real wonderful Christians, all of them. I like to hear Mr. Decker pray better than almost any other man in our meeting; and as for Norman, he leads a meeting beautifully. They say Mr. Sherrill thought at first that he ought to preach; but now he says he is reconciled; there is greater need for Christian physicians than for ministers. Mr. Sherrill has always been great friends with all the Deckers. You remember he was, from the first. Norman studied with him all the time he was managing that first little bit of a restaurant in the square room of the old Decker house. They tore down that house last month to make room for a carriage drive around the back of their new house, and they say Nettie cried when the square room was torn up. She has some of the quaintest furniture; sofas, she calls them, made out of boxes; and a queer old-fashioned hour-glass stand, and a barrel chair, which have been sent on with all her elegant things to New York. She is going to furnish a room for Gerald and her with them; he made them, it seems, when they began that queer scheme. Who would have supposed it could grow as it did? It really seems as though the Lord must have had a good deal to do with it, doesn't it? I tell you, Irene, it is wonderful how many young men they have helped save, those two. It seems a pity sometimes that they could not have told us girls what they were about, and let us help. But then, I don't know as we would have helped if we had understood. I used to be such a perfect little idiot then. Well, it was Nettie Decker got hold of me at last. Norman signed the pledge that night when General McClintock lectured here, and during the winter he was converted. But it was 2 years after that before I made up my mind. I was miserable all that time, too, because I knew I was doing wrong. And I didn't treat Nettie wonderfully well any of the time. But when she came to see me with her eyes shining with tears, and said she had been praying for me ever since that day of the flower party, I just broke down. Oh, Irene, there's the carriage with the bride and groom and Norman and Ermina. Doesn't the bride look lovely? I wish they had had a public wedding, and let us all see her. But they say General McClintock thinks weddings ought to be very private. Never mind, we will see her at the reception next week. But then she won't be Nettie Decker. We shall have to say good-bye to her." And Miss Lorena Barstow stood still in the street, and shaded her eyes from the sunlight to watch the bridal party as the carriage wound around the square, looking her last, with tender, loving eyes, upon Nettie Decker. End of Chapter 24. End of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy.